Hi, fourth grade. So we are going to be starting a new read aloud. It is called The Kidnapped Prince, The Life of Olaudah Equiano. And this book is actually adapted from an autobiography, which means that the person wrote about themselves. So in the 1700s, there was this man, Olaudah Equiano, who wrote a story about his life. And I'll give you a little bit of background about who he is, and then we're going to jump into the book. Um, so Olaudah Equiano was an 11-year-old African boy who was the prince of this place in Africa called Benin, and at that time he was kidnapped and taken off to the New World, where he eventually became a slave. So we're going to be reading a little bit day by day of who he is and a little bit of his story. So the book is on my computer, so I'm going to be reading it off my computer. And this is a newer book for me, so if I stumble or mess up, just bear with me. We're going to read maybe like 6 chapters today, and hopefully we'll finish this book by Friday. If not, then we will finish it early next week. So, Chapter 1, My Home. I was born not far from the equator in an African village. Our village was in the province of Esaka, the kingdom of Benin. Hundreds of miles to the south of us was the Guinea coast, the ports where the slave traders came and the shores of the Atlantic Ocean. I was a child. I had never seen the ocean. I had never even heard of white men, or Europeans, or the sea. Our town was far inland, in a beautiful fertile valley. Among us, nobody was a beggar and nobody was homeless. We were all farmers and warriors, and all of us, even the most important people, worked. A few miles outside town, we cultivated fields where we grow our food, bananas and yams, peppers and corn, and pineapples and many other fruits. We tapped small holes in palm trees and fastened empty gourds to them to collect delicious sweet palm wine. We raised cattle and goats and poultry too, to eat, but also to trade. We also traded a salt, which we made from ashes, and a kind of fragrant powdered earth. When this earth was thrown into a fire, it gave off a powerful sweet smell like incense. Men and women wore perfume made of palm oil and powdered, deliciously fragrant wood. Nobody drank alcohol. Our palm wine had hardly any alcohol in it. Our people did smoke clay pipes, pipes with wooden stems so long that it took 1 or sometimes 2 boys to carry them. Our women were alert and modest and graceful, and on their legs and arms wore many bracelets of gold. Besides working in the fields with the men, they made pottery and spun and wove cotton. They used a berry to dye the cotton in beautiful shade of blue. Everybody, men and women and children, dressed in this blue cloth. Later on in my life, I went to many places, but I never saw that special shade of blue. You know what that blue cloth is. You learned about it in 3rd grade. Our people believed in God, one creator of all things, who lived in the sun. He didn't eat or drink, we thought, because of a belt that he wore tied around his waist. But sometimes, like us, he smoked a pipe. We believed God controlled everything that happened. Especially we thought he decided things about our death, or our capture in battle. Also we believed that our dear friends and relations who had died watched over us, and guarded us from bad spirits, from our enemies. We never fought with our fists, or cursed, as Europeans do. The worst expressions we ever used were, "May you rot," or "May you swell," or "May a beast take you." We were very clean, and had many rituals of washing. Anyone who touched the dead had to wash and purify themselves before he could enter a house, or touch any person, or anything we ate. We were very careful not to eat poisoned food whenever we bought food to eat. The seller had to kiss it all over to show that it was not poisoned. Even at home, we sometimes kissed food this way, especially if food and drink were being presented to a stranger. Every time before we ate, we washed our hands. Then we poured a little food or drink on the ground in a special place. That was the offering we made to the good spirits who watched over us. Our people all loved music. Almost every person in our town was a poet, a musician, and a dancer. We celebrated every important event with big public dances, with songs and music made up just for that occasion. We played drums and an instrument like a guitar, and one like a staccato. Our songs were about the things that mattered to us. For that reason, they were always new and changing and full of life. Our biggest holiday was New Year's. On New Year's Day, when the sun set, We set up a cheer that could be heard all the way across our country, and we made a tremendous noise with rattles. Then we made many offerings to the spirits of our ancestors, and the children who were supposed to be lucky were carried around and shown to the people. When I was small, I was carried around that way. Some of our families had slaves. Our slaves were prisoners we had captured in battle, or people who had committed some crime. They worked just the same as we did, no more, and their food and clothing and houses were just the same as ours. Some of our slaves even had slaves under them to help them. We treated them just the same as us, except for one thing. They were not permitted to eat at the same table with the free people. In town, each family had its own land, surrounded by moats and wooden fences or sometimes red clay brick walls. Every head of a family had one wife, or sometimes two. The wives were considered his property. He had one wooden house for himself and others for his wives and children and his slaves. Whenever someone needed a house, the whole village helped build it. The only thing people expected in return was a feast. Because my father had many slaves, his piece of land was very big. It was like a little village in itself, full of one-storied, thatched-roofed houses. The floors of the houses were covered with reed mats. Our chairs were wooden logs. Our beds were wooden platforms 3 or 4 feet high. On top of them, we laid the spongy parts of plantain trees, and they made soft mattresses, which we then covered with animal skins. Our town had bearded wise men, the Aofewaka. They calculated our calendar and foretold events. They were our doctors, too. They healed wounds and cured people who had been poisoned. We respected them, but we also feared them. When the Aofewaka died, only other wise men went to his funeral. The wise man who had died would be buried after sunset, with many of his tools and valuable things. Afterward, the other wise men would always return from the burial place, a different way than the one they had taken to get there. When I was born, the wise men told everyone I would be lucky. I was named Olaudah, which in our language means fortunate, and someone who speaks well with a loud voice. We had many snakes, and some of them, we thought, gave omens of the future. When I was small, 2 enormous snakes, thick as a man's leg, crept into my mother's house one night while we were sleeping. We told the wise men the snakes were with us. The wise men said that I should touch them, because it would bring me luck. I put my hand on the snakes, which were harmless and very tame. Then we put them on a big earthenware pan and carried them out the road. Another time, a poisonous snake crossed the road and passed between my feet without touching me. The people who saw this were very surprised. The wise men and my mother, and the rest of the people too, thought these were remarkable omens in my favor. The villages of Benin were all independent of each other, and the king of Benin did not really control them. The only government I knew was our village chiefs. The chiefs were called embranches. They made rules and settled arguments and punished crimes. Being an embranche was a big job, like being a prince, a judge, a senator, all in one. My father was an embranche. Like all the embranches, he had a special ceremonial mark. In a ritual, the skin on his forehead had been cut and rolled down to his eyebrows, then pressed against his head. His face bore the mark of a healed wound, a thick band of skin across his forehead. It was called the mark of greatness. I had watched one of my older brothers go through the ritual to become an embranche. One day, I would become an embranche too, and my parents would give me that mark. Kidnapped. In our village, we were always ready for war. These wars were usually surprise attacks from strangers from another district who wanted to take prisoners or booty, which is another word for treasure. Often, the attacks came when we were out of the village working in the fields. When we were afraid of the village being invaded, we guarded the streets leading to our houses with stakes struck into the ground. The exposed ends of the stakes had sharp points dipped in poison. The attacker who stepped on one would die. It took a couple of hours to walk to our fields from the village. To prevent surprise attacks on the way to the fields, neighbors always walked together, carrying their hoes and axes and shovels and their weapons too. Our weapons were guns, bows and arrows, and broad 2-edged swords. We also had spears, and also huge shields that could cover a man from head to foot. Everybody was taught how to use these weapons, even the women. Our whole district was like a volunteer army. We all knew the warning signals, like the firing of a gun at night. When a signal came, we grabbed our weapons and rushed out of our houses to fight. Children were warriors too. From when I was very little, I was trained to fight. Every day I practiced shooting and spear throwing. My mother decorated me with the emblems of war, the same ones our greatest fighters used. Once, when I was small, I saw a battle in the fields. We were all working there when we were suddenly attacked. I climbed a tree at a distance and watched the fight. There were many women as well as men on both sides. I saw my mother fighting, swinging her broadsword. A furious battle raged for a long time and many people were killed. Then our village won and took the enemy's chief as prisoner. We carried him back to the village in triumph. He offered a big ransom for his life, but we would not accept it. He was put to death. It was always the enemy chiefs who started the fighting. We knew any who went free would bring a new army and return to do us harm. A young woman among our enemies had been slain in battle. We hung her arm in the market where we always showed the trophies of battle. The weapons and belongings of enemy fighters were divided among the warriors. We awarded the most to those who had fought best. The prisoners were not sold or ransomed, we kept as slaves. I had 5 older brothers and 1 sister. Because I was the youngest, I was my mother's favorite. I went everywhere with her. Often, when I went with her to the market, we saw strangers, big men who carried huge empty sacks. We called them Oibo, which meant red men living at a distance. They brought with them things we didn't have: firearms, gunpowder, hats, beads, and dried fish. They traded these things with us to get the things they didn't have: fragrant wood and earth, and the salt we made of wood ashes. They always carried slaves with them too, but we didn't let them cross our land until they explained how they got the slaves. Sometimes we sold slaves to them, but only prisoners of war, or our own people who had been convicted of kidnapping or other crimes. I didn't know it then, but now I think that getting salt and fragrant wood was not the traders' real purpose. Probably slaves were what they wanted most. With offers of guns and gunpowder and other things from Europe, they tempted the rival chiefs into their desperate prisoner-taking raids. When the grown people went to the fields to work, usually we children stayed behind in the village to play. Kidnappers would take advantage of our parents being away to carry off as many of us as they could seize. Usually, some of us would get up in the trees to be lookouts and watch for strangers. One day, as I was watching on the top of a tree in our big yard, I saw a kidnapper come into the neighbor's yard. There were lots of children playing there, and he intended to take some, but I gave the alarm. The strongest children came running with ropes. They tangled him up in so many cords that he had no way to get loose. We held him like that until some grown-ups came and took him prisoner. But not long after, another attack came, and that day there were no grown-ups nearby. I was 11. I was only with my sister, who was always my favorite playmate. As usual, all the grown-ups were gone to the fields. My sister and I were left to take care of the house. 2 men and a woman got over our walls and in a moment seized us both. We had no chance to cry out or resist. Quickly they covered our mouths and ran with us into the woods. They stopped to tie our hands. Then they carried us again as far as they could till night came on. We reached a small house where the robbers halted to eat and spend the night. They untied us and offered us food, but we couldn't eat. We were so choked with tiredness and grief. Finally sleep came. For a little while it took away our pain. The next morning we left the house and continued traveling all day. For a long time we stayed in the woods, but at last we came into a road which I believed I knew. I saw some people at a distance. As loud as I could, I cried for help. The kidnappers tied me tighter, stopped my mouth, and put me into an enormous sack. They did that to my sister too, and so we went on till the people who might have helped us were out of sight. The next night we went to rest. The kidnappers offered us food again, but we refused. All night we held each other and cried, but soon we lost even the small comfort of crying together. The next day the kidnappers pulled my sister away from me. We held on to each other and begged them not to separate us, but the kidnappers took my sister and carried her away. I went almost crazy from losing her. I cried all the time. For several days I wouldn't eat anything except what the kidnappers forced me to eat. I planned to run away. We traveled many days, and I often changed masters. Finally, I got into the hands of the chieftain in a pleasant country. Although I was a great many days' journey from my father's house, these people spoke our language. The man had 2 wives and some children. They treated me extremely well, and did all they could to comfort me, particularly the first wife, who was something like my mother. Still, I was weighed down by the homesickness for my mother and my friends. Also, I didn't dare to eat with the freeborn children, even though I mostly was with them. That made me want my freedom even more. My new master was a goldsmith. I pumped air on his fire from the bellows made of leather, so he could make gold ornaments. After I had been in this place about a month, they all started to trust me a little way from the house. I used my freedom to ask the way to my home. I sometimes went with the older girls in the cool of the evenings to bring pitchers of water home from the springs. I found opportunities to ask my way then too. Every day during my journey, I had watched where the sun rose in the morning and set in the evening. I knew now that my father's house was toward the east. I planned to seize the first chance to escape and to go in the direction of the rising sun. But while I was planning my escape, I had an unlikely accident. I used to help an elderly woman slave cook and take care of the poultry. One morning, while I was feeding some chickens, I threw a stone at one of them. The stone hit right in the middle and killed it. The old slave woman soon missed the chicken and asked me where it was. My mother had taught me not to lie. I told the old woman my stone had killed it. She flew into a rage. "You'll suffer for that," she said. Right away she said to her mistress what I had done. This scared me very much. I expected an instant flogging, and I dreaded it. I almost had never been beaten at home. I decided to escape. I ran into a thicket nearby and hid in the bushes. Soon afterward, my mistress and the slave returned. They didn't see me, but I could see them searching the whole house all around, calling for me. I didn't answer. They thought I had run away, and they alerted everyone in the neighborhood to pursue me. In that part of the country, and where my family had lived too, the woods were so thick that a person could hide and escape the closest search. The neighbors looked for me the whole day. Several times many of them came within a few yards of the place where I lay hid. When I heard a rustling in the trees, I expected them to find me any minute and take me back and to be punished by my master. But they never found me. They were often so near that I heard them guess where I might be. "He's trying to get home," someone said, "but it's so far and such a hard trip, he'll never make it." When I heard that, I felt a panic. I despaired. Night came on and increased my fears. I had planned to start home at dark, but the searchers had convinced me it was useless. Even if I could escape all the other animals, I was afraid I couldn't escape the human ones. Even if I did escape them, I didn't know the way. I could end up dying in the woods. I heard rustlings in the leaves, and it was probably snakes moving in the dark. Any second, one could bite me. I left the thicket. I crept to my master's kitchen, which was an open shed, and laid myself down in the ashes, wishing for death. I was barely awake in the morning when the old woman slave, who was first up, came to light the fire and saw me in the fireplace. She was so surprised to see me, she could hardly believe her eyes. She went to the master and asked him to be kind to me. He soon came. He scolded me a little, but he ordered me to be taken care of and not ill-treated. Soon after this, my master's only child by his first wife got sick and died. He felt very bad. For some time he was almost frantic. He really would have killed himself, but people watched him all the time and kept him from doing it. Soon afterward he recovered, and I was sold again. I meet my sister. I was carried to the left of the sun's rising, through dismal woods where wild beasts roared. The people I was sold to were well armed, but they were not unkind. When I was tired, they used to carry me, either on shoulders or their backs. At night we slept in well-built houses along the side of the road. Merchants and regular travelers had built these houses for shelter. We traveled like this a long time, so that I learned 2 or 3 new languages in order to speak to people. One night in the house where we were sheltered, a girl was brought in, my own dear sister. As soon as she saw me, she screamed and ran into my arms. For a long time, all we could do was cling to each other and cry. When the people knew we were brother and sister, they let us be together. The man to whom we belonged slept between us, and all night she and I held each other's hands across his sleeping body. Until morning we forgot all of our troubles in the joy of being together. But as soon as the sun had risen, our owner sold my sister. She was torn away from me, and all my misery returned. What would happen to us? I didn't know. But I was afraid she was going to suffer even more than me, and I would not be there to help her. I loved her very much. I would have stood every pain for her. I would have won freedom for her, even it meant if I never got my own. Much later, when things went well for me, I would think of her and become sad. When things were bad for me, I would think of her and feel even more bitter. We had spent our last night together. I would never forget her. I never saw her again. Tinna, the Scarred People. I too was soon sold, and traveled on till after a long time I came to a town called Tinna, in the most beautiful country I had ever seen in Africa. The towns had many streams and a pond in the center of town where people washed. They had coconuts and sugar cane, which I never had tasted before. For money, the people used little white seashells the size of a fingernail. A wealthy widow bought me for 172 of these seashells. She wanted me for a companion for her only son. She took me to her house, and I was washed and ate with him and became his playmate. The language his people spoke was so much like mine that I understood him perfectly. I was older than my new friend, and he always treated me with respect. He would never start to eat until I started. Slaves waited on us, and we played with darts and bows and arrows, the way I used to do it at home. For 2 months I lived like this. I started to feel happy and forget the terrible things that had happened to me. I thought I was going to be adopted into the family. But one morning early, while her son was still asleep, the widow woke me up and hurried me away to sell me. Now I was carried off among people who used iron pots for cooking and had European crossbows and cutlasses for weapons, things I'd never seen before. What most amazed me was that they didn't make any offerings to God or the spirits of their ancestors. These people ate without washing their hands and fought with their fists. They ornamented themselves with scars and filed their teeth to sharp points. They wanted to scar me too and file my teeth, but I wouldn't let them do it. At last we came to the banks of a large river. I had never seen of any body of water larger than a pond, and the size of the river amazed me. Here by the river, the people didn't live in houses at all. They lived in big canoes where they kept everything they owned. At times, people dived from canoes and swam. Both men and women did it. I was amazed again. In our village, we didn't know how to swim. Soon I was put into one of the canoes. We began to paddle and move along the river. I was very surprised and afraid. We continued till evening. When we came to land, some families dragged their canoes on shore and made fires on the river bank. Others cooked in their canoes and slept in them all night. The canoe I was in was beached. Reed mats were used to make tents in the shape of little houses, and inside of them we slept. The slave ship. So I traveled both by land and by water through different countries till 6 or 7 months after I'd been kidnapped. I arrived at the coast. The first thing I saw was a vast ocean and a ship, riding at anchor waiting for its cargo. The ocean and the ship filled me with astonishment that soon turned to fear. I was taken to the ship and carried on board. The crew had strange complexions and long hair. Their language was very different from any I'd ever heard. Some of them thumped me and tossed me around to see if I was healthy. I was sure that I had gotten to a world of bad spirits, and they were going to kill me. I was terrified. I wished I was anyone but me. But I would rather have seen even the lowest slave in my own country. I would have rather have been the lowest slave in my own country. If I had owned 10,000 worlds, I would have given them all to change my lot for his. When I looked around the ship, I saw a furnace boiling on the deck, and many black people all chained together. Every one of their faces full of sorrow. I was overpowered by horror and fainted. When I recovered, I saw some black people around me. They were some of those who had brought me on board, and they were receiving their pay. They tried to cheer me, but in vain. I asked them if we were not to be eaten by those white men with horrible looks, red faces, and long hair. No, they said. A white man brought me a little liquor in a wine glass. I was afraid of him, and wouldn't take it out of his hand. A black took it from him and gave it to me, and I swallowed a little of it. I had never had alcohol before. The strange sensation it gave me threw me into the greatest consternation. Soon after this, the blacks who had brought me on board went off the ship, and left me abandoned to despair. I had no chance now of returning to my country, and not even the smallest chance of getting back to shore. The crew took me down below the decks into the ship's stinking hold. With the horribleness of stench and my crying, I was so sick and low that I couldn't eat. I wanted to die. 2 white men offered me food, but I refused to eat. Then one of them held me fast by the hand and laid me across the windlass. He tied my feet while the other flogged me. When they let me loose, I wanted to jump into the sea. Even though I couldn't swim and I was afraid of the water, I still wanted to do it. I couldn't. Nets were stretched all along the sides of the ship, and they were too high for me to jump. Besides, the sailors watched us all the time if we weren't chained down to the decks. Days later, I saw some poor Africans severely whipped for trying to jump overboard, and every hour there were Africans whipped for not eating. It often happened to me. That first day, among the poor chained men in the hold, I found some people of Benin. "What are they going to do to us?" I asked. "They are taking us away to work for them," a man from Benin explained. "And do they only live here?" I asked, "in this hollow place, the ship?" "They have a white people's country," the man explained, "but it is far away." "How can it be?" I asked. "That in our whole country nobody ever heard of them?" "They live very far away," another man explained. "Where are their women?" I asked. "Do they have any?" "Yes," the first man said. "Why don't we see them?" "They leave them behind." "How can the ship go?" I asked. "We don't know exactly," they said. "They put cloth on those tall poles with the help of ropes. Then the vessel goes. Besides that, they have some spell or magic they put into the water that make the ship stop when they want it to." I was excitingly amazed at this account and really thought the white people were spirits from another world. I really wanted to get away from them, but I felt a little less scared, knowing they were taking us to work. If that was all they did to me, I could stand it. Despite what the men from Benin had told me, I was often afraid I should be put to death. The white people looked and acted so savage. I had never seen such brutal cruelty. At times, while we were anchored off the coast, I and many others were permitted to stay on deck. One day, to my great astonishment, I saw one of the ships coming in with the sails up. As soon as the whites saw it, they gave it a great shout, at which we were amazed. The vessel got larger as it got nearer, and the anchor was let go. I and my countrymen were convinced it was done by magic. Soon after this, other ship got her boats out, and they came on board of us. The people of both ships seemed very glad to see each other. Several of the strangers shook hands with us black people and made signs with their hands. I suppose they were trying to tell us that we were going to their country, but we did not understand them. At last our ship got in all her cargo. The crew made the ship ready with many frightening noises. We were all put under deck, so that we could not see how they managed the vessel. In the hold of the ship many of us died, victims of the greed of our purchasers. All of us were penned up together, crowded so close that we could hardly turn around. Our chains galled us. Open tubs were used for toilets. Often children fell into them and nearly drowned. The heat caused heavy perspiration, sweat, and the air became unfit to breathe. It sickened us. It almost suffocated us. And in this thick air, the shrieks of women and the groans of the dying vibrated hour upon hour. Fortunately, I was soon so near death that they kept me on deck almost all the time, and because I was so young, I wasn't changed. Nearly every day, some of my companions were brought upon the deck at the point of death. I hoped that I would soon die too. Often I thought that the inhabitants of the deep were much happier than I. I envied the fish of their freedom, and I wished I could have changed my lot for theirs. Everything I saw convinced me more of the cruelty of the whites. One day they netted a lot of fish. They killed and ate all they wanted. Those of us who were on the deck begged for some fish, but they threw the rest back into the sea. A few of my countrymen were very hungry, tried to take some of the fish when they thought no one was watching, but they were caught and flogged severely. Also, the cruelty wasn't only toward us blacks, but also toward some of the whites themselves. Once I saw a white man flogged so unmercifully with a rope that he died, and they tossed him over the side of the ship like a dead animal. During our trip I saw flying fish, which surprised me very much. They used to fly across the ship, and many of them fell into the deck. Also, I saw the first use of the ship's quadrant. I had often seen the sailors make observations with it. One of them let me look through it. The moving clouds looked to me like land that disappeared. But how could land disappear? I was sure that I was in another world, and everything around me was magic. All right, 4th grade. Deep breath in through your nose. Out with your mouth. We know that when we're reading about this and we're talking about this, it can feel like a lot. So it's okay to stop and take a break and think about what happened and ask questions. So a question I have for you that I want you to comment below is, how are you feeling? How do you think the character Olaudah is feeling? What's going on here? So think about how you would be feeling and how this character is feeling, and I want you to comment that below. Hopefully we can finish this book by the rest of the week. Bye, 4th grade.